Hi, this is Lori and welcome to my series on the Pico W. In this episode, we're going to continue the work we did on the HSV to RGB converter project, where we're going to use a Pimoroni Pico Display 2.0 to show the conversions between HSV and RGB and back again. So the second part, so if you haven't watched the first part, we kind of go through all the theory of how HSV to RGB conversions work and developed a couple of functions that we could use to do that. Now we're going to use our Pico Display 2.0 to have some fun with those functions and create a little project. Just a reminder, this is the Pico display that we're going to use. And we have the 4 buttons and the RGB LED and a nice LCD display. There's also the Pico display, which is a smaller version, and I showed both in the previous episode, so if you want to take a closer look at those, do more discussion, but either of those can work for this project, along with a Pico. All we need is a regular Pico, but you can plug a Pico W into the back as well. So since we're using one of the Pimoroni micropython projects, and I actually discussed this in the very first episode in this series about there are different flavors of micropython. Up to this point, we've always used the regular old micropython, but this time I'm going to put the Pimoroni micropython on my Pico. And if you haven't done that in a while, you might have forgotten how, but to put a new version on, I'm going to do it through Thonny. So I just put some instructions on here to show how Thonny loading a different version of MicroPython onto your Pico works. So when you're plugging in your Pico to your computer with your cable, you'll want to press this boot select button at the same time you plug the cable in. And then inside of Thonny, you'll then be able to click on this little spot area down here, and you can choose Install MicroPython. Now, if you do that, that'll pop up this window, and you can see there's actually a lot of different versions of MicroPython you could put onto your Pico or Pico W. You'll have to scroll down till you find Raspberry Pi, Pico, Pico H with Pimoroni libraries. And choose that one, so it'll look like this. And I have at this point of the video, I have the newest version of MicroPython here, 1.21. And click Install. And then that'll get the most recent version of MicroPython on there, and we're using the one with the Pimoroni libraries in it. So if you're using Pimoroni products and you don't want to go through Thonny to load their version of MicroPython, you can also get the UF2 file. So the best thing to do when you get one of their products is to go to their page where you bought it and scroll around till you find the Getting Started section for that product. And you'll see what all they have available for it. And almost always there's a link to their UF2 files for their version of MicroPython. And so you can load it that way without having to go through Thonny if that's not how you prefer to do it. Then they have some help, some getting started with the Pico. So if this was your first place, that you can do a little training in the Pico. Then they'll often have example code, and we'll run a couple of their example codes because that's one of the best ways to learn how to use their products is to go through and run their examples. They often teach you some cool ways to interact with their products. And then we're going to be using their Pico graphics library to put things onto the display. And so they have a function reference, and there's a link here to that. So that's useful to do. And you can see they'll give you a lot of nice information about how to use their product. Now, when you go in and use some of their example code, this is one of my beefs with Pimoroni is sometimes they just don't document things enough. And in their version of MicroPython, they have a library that is very helpful and useful, but it's hard to know how to use it to its fullest extent. So I found the only way to kind of get in there and understand that particular library, Pimoroni library, is to find it on their GitHub site and actually look at it and read it to see what those functions do and how to use them and what options there are available. So I just put this on here so you could see where the Pimoroni library is in their GitHub site. I mean, you have to kind of poke around till you find it. And I don't know, maybe I'm slow, but it took me a while to find it. And I'm going to use, for example, their RGB LED functions to use the RGB LED on our display. And I just wanted to understand how it was coded so I could learn how to use this function and what kind of options I had. So that's, like I said, one of my complaints, and that's kind of as far as I can tell, that's the only way around unless they have documented that library. So like the Pico graphics library, they did put some nice documentation together, but this Pimoroni library, which has like buttons and RGB LED in it, they didn't really document that. So as far as I know, the only way to kind of figure that out is to come here and look at the actual code they put together for those functions. If you click on the link for the example programs, it'll take you to this GitHub site where there are example programs written for the product that you've purchased from Pimoroni, and I definitely recommend downloading those programs and going through them, because that's sort of the way that Pimoroni documents all the features of their products and how to use them, which is a little bit of a complaint of mine because I don't think that's enough documentation, but that's sort of how you have to do it. And we're going to run a couple of them to learn how to use the buttons, how to use the display, and how to use the RGB LED so we can do our project. Well, now we're finally to getting a chance to play with our Pico Display 2.0. And I have a couple of the example programs from Pimoroni here for us to run. First one we'll run is called rainbow.py. And it shows us how to import the libraries that we'll need from the Pico graphics and the Pimoroni. So we'll import the display, and if we're using the 2.0, then it's display Pico display _2, and if you're using the smaller one, you take the _2 away. And here's where we set it up, and you can change the backlighting. Here's the LED. The red, green, and blue LEDs are on pin 6, 7, and 8. That's how this board is set up. We're creating a pin in black here, so this is the RGB values to create black, and we'll use that for the text that's going to go on the display. And you can see that they borrowed from CircuitPython a function to convert HSV to RGB. And now that we've spent enough time learning, we could probably decipher this one, and you can see it looks pretty efficient, but kind of similar with the 5 sections. 6 sections, I should say. Then we'll start with the hue set to 0, and it's going to be in this while true loop, and each time it's going to increment the hue by 1 degree. And here's a one-liner, a Python one-liner to do the conversion and then give that back and turn it into a 0 to 255 scale, so that's pretty nice. Then we'll set the RGB LED to the converted values for red, green, and blue. And we'll create a pin in that color to fill up the screen with that. So that's what this pin is doing here. And then when we clear, we're going to clear with that color. And then we're going to switch to the black pin so that we can write some text onto the screen, Pico Disco, at pixel 10 in the X direction and pixel 10 in the Y. And these are a couple things for scaling and word wrapping. We'll update the display, sleep for a little bit, and keep looping through the color wheel. All right, so let's run it and watch it go. And hopefully you can see the color changing. Now it's hard to film an RGB LED, and I don't really have any good way to put a diffuser on here, but you can see the color of the display pretty well with my camera. So yeah, it's just going on through the color wheel and looping through the colors. Well, that looks pretty good. All right, so we'll stop that one. And then we're going to run the button test. So the button test example is nice because it shows us how to set up the buttons. Again, we're setting up the display and importing. That all looks pretty similar to before. And then here's the 4 buttons and the pins that they're connected to. Then they're pre-setting up several colors to use in this example. And then created a little handy clear function, and I stole this because it's really nice to clear out the display for the next time you're putting something on the screen. And here we go in the while true loop. We're gonna read the button A, and if it's pressed, we're gonna say it was pressed, and same for B, X, and Y, and otherwise it'll say press any button. And we'll sleep just a little bit to, I guess, debounce things and how frequently we want to check to see if the buttons have been pressed. So let's go ahead and run that. And so now we can press any button. So let's try pressing the A button. Button A was pressed. That's the B button. Button B was pressed. And button X was pressed. And button Y was pressed. And it'll just keep going until we're tired of running that. All right, so that taught us a little bit, and I think interestingly in here they talk about that this is a way to use buttons without having to use interrupts, and I've been a huge fan of using interrupts with buttons, so I decided to try to use this when we control this device as well, use their strategy here for detecting button presses. All right, let's get on to some of our own code. Well, I borrowed the idea of looping through the color wheel and decided to adapt it a little bit to use my own conversion functions. So I'll import sleep and the Pico graphics and Pimoroni library for the RGB LED, and then I'll import the conversion functions that we've learned how to do. We'll set up the display just like they have, and set up some of the color pins in the RGB LED. And then what I'm going to do in the while true loop is loop through hue 0 to 359, and I'm going to loop by 5-degree increments. Then we'll take and make an HSV out of that, so the saturation and value will be set to 1. Then we'll use my conversion function to convert that hue, saturation, and value into an RGB code. And then we'll go ahead and set the RGB LED to that. And then we'll create a color so that we can fill the screen with that color, just like they did in the rainbow program using our RGB value. And we'll fill it up with that color. Then we'll set to black so we can put some text on the screen. And what we'll print on the screen is the RGB code and also the hue, saturation, and value code. And we'll just watch that run. And I've tried to tidy this up a little bit so that we can actually exit without leaving colors and lights on in the display. So let's get this kind of set a little bit more square. There we go. And let's go ahead and run this one. There you go. So the hue is switching every 5 degrees, and we can see the RGB codes coming there. I was looking up at my monitor. But yeah, it looks like it's working pretty well, and the LED does seem to be following along, the same colors. And I will say you can get a lot of nice colors on the display, and they don't always show super well on an RGB LED. So there's kind of some limitations using those and making fine differences between some of the colors. Sometimes the RGB LED just sort of looks, you know, a particular color, and shades and small differences in the settings that aren't necessarily apparent to the eye, when it's much more apparent when we're looking at the screen here. So that's one reason why I wanted to use the screen to see. So that seems to be working pretty good. All right, let's go on to another program. In this program, I just wanted to work with the buttons and adjust different RGB values using the buttons. So there's 4 buttons. Well, we're going to use 3 of them, one for red, one for green, and one for blue. And we'll press the button, and every time you quick press it, it'll move by 5, I think. And then if you hold and press and hold, it'll keep increasing. And then when it gets to 255, it'll loop back around and go back to 0. So we don't need an up and down button for each color. We're just going to have one button that will loop through 0 to 255 and just keep looping around. All right, so the setup's pretty similar as to what we've done before. And you can see here I'm setting up the RGB LED and just the 3 buttons that we're going to use. So we're not using button Y. And I stole that nice clear function from Pimoroni. I thought that was nice. And then I'm going to set the initial RGB color that we'll start on to be just full red. And we'll go ahead and light the RGB LED, and we'll fill up the screen with that color as well. And then we'll put onto the display the text that tells us what the RGB value is currently displayed on the LED and on the display itself. Update. All right, so that puts the initial one on, and then as we go into the while true loop, if we press the button, so for example, we press A, then we're going to increase the red one by 5, and if it's already at 255, then it'll start back over again at 0. So that's what this if else does. And you can see the B button controls the green, and the X button controls the blue. And then once that's done, it just always keeps looking and making sure that the LED and the display are at the correct colors, and it tells us what the RGB code is. So let's go ahead and run this, and I'll try to be careful to keep that in the screen as I press the buttons to show you how it works. So go ahead and run it. And of course, if we don't do anything, it's just going to sit here at red 255. So I'm going to go ahead and add in, just make sure I stay on the screen here, so I'm looking up at my monitor. I'll add in some green, and you can see as I do that, you'll hopefully start to see the display kind of changing colors. And we're getting more closer to the yellow that we would expect. And if I press and hold, it just keeps going. Oh, you can see it flashed by as it went through. So now let's try adding in some blue. And I'll just press and hold a little bit. And yeah, you can see it going there. We're getting some nice purples. And if I press the red, we'll take the red completely out there. And now I'm going to add some more red back in. So the buttons work pretty well. And even though they only go one direction, I think it's a lot of fun to play with. I mean, I enjoyed it. Some of my family members enjoyed playing with this when I handed it to them, and they enjoyed seeing the LED and the screen changing colors. All right, so that's the RGB button control program. So I think we got a good grasp of how to use these buttons on the Pico display, and so let's take this just a little bit further and include our conversions as well. Well, these have been some pretty long episodes for me. It took a little while to explain it. I'm sure most of you are fast forwarding through the parts that seem to go a little slow, but I think I've said this before, but I do really make these videos for myself, because I find if I make them, I remember the concepts, and it helps me remember how I put things together. And then if I don't remember, I can go back and watch the video again. So that was how I got started. And I've enjoyed making them, and it makes me happy that some of you find them useful too. All right, so here's our final program. Now we're going to use our display, and instead we're going to convert, we're going to input HSV and then convert that back to RGB. So we'll use the buttons to control the hue, the saturation, and the value, and it'll show us the conversion back to RGB. All right, so pretty much it's the same kind of setup here, but now we're setting up the initial hue, saturation, and value, converting that back to red, green, and blue. And so I'm just individually naming those this time around. That seemed to be a little bit easier than how I did it in the program we just saw. Set the RGB LED, set the color just like we had before, and then put all that information onto the screen. And then in the while true loop, we'll just check for the buttons, and button A will advance the hue, button B will advance saturation, and button X will advance the value. And then we'll continually check for any changes and update the screen and the RGB LED and the text on the screen. And we'll have a nice clear cleanup if we press Control-C. All right, let's let this one go. There we are, and so you can see we started at our familiar red color. And if I go ahead and press the hue button, you can see we're going to increase the hue. And I'm just pressing and holding a little bit. Now if I press this B button, it's going to change the saturation. It's going to loop back around, so you can see the effect of saturation on that, so kind of flashing through there. And then the X button is value, right? So yeah, if I press it once, it kind of grays it out pretty heavily, and we can watch what happens to value if I just hold the button. So yeah, we can have a lot of fun with this, and it's I really enjoy this display, and I think it made a pretty good tool for us to try out our HSV to RGB converter functions and visually see them on both the LED and the display. Well, that's the end of this project, and I hope you've enjoyed seeing how this works and traveling with me as we puzzled out how HSV and RGB conversions work so that we can understand them fully rather than just mindlessly copying code from somebody else. Thanks for watching.